We'll have a series of questions now from the members. Each of them gets 5 minutes, and I'll start with myself. Under the bill, all facilities, both domestic and foreign, seeking to market food in the U.S. must register each year and provide certain information about the facility to the FDA. If the facility is not registered, it's illegal to market food from that facility in the U.S., and in order to register, each facility would be required to pay $1,000 per year as a registration fee. Now, my understanding is there was, in 2002, there was bioterrorism legislation, and under that legislation, food facilities were required to register, but there was no requirement to update that registration. So my questions reference that registration under the 2002 bill. Has that system resulted in problems in terms of FDA's ability to accurately account for all facilities selling food in the U.S., and maybe you can tell us what problems exist? And then the second part is, do you believe that linking a fee to the requirement to register would help address whatever problems exist under this system that dates back to that 2002 bioterrorism legislation?
Thank you. I think it is clear, based on the experience since the Bioterrorism Act in 2002, that we do need the extended authorities that would be offered in this bill. We know that when a facility registers once but doesn't have to register again, that it does create problems in terms of our ability to fully understand the nature of the food-related activities in that facility. The Peanut Corporation of America, I think, is one good example, where when they first registered, they weren't actually making peanut butter, and then they added that to their activities. With annual registration, we would have a much better record and understanding of the activities, and it would provide us with the tools to be more responsible in our oversight and in our inspections. With respect to the issue of fees, I think it's a very important component of any food safety plan that Congress would enact. We absolutely need to have the resources to do our job. I understand that fees represent a burden on companies, and I wish that we were not dependent on that mechanism in all cases, but I do think that that fee is an investment in a robust and effective food safety system. That fee will go to enable the FDA to provide certain specific services and put in place the broad and modernized food safety system that American consumers expect and need.
All right, now let me go back to this fee, because in the President's budget, he asked $75 million in registration and reinspection fees. So obviously the administration has already shown support for the concept of a registration fee for food facilities in the budget. However, in our bill, with its $1,000 per facility fee, we would generate much more than the $75 million that's in the President's budget. So I wanted you to explain, if you could, what was contemplated in the President's budget request of the $75 million. Did that request seek to address the new authorities provided in this bill?
Well, the President's budget request was, of course, put together before the specifics of this proposed legislation was put forward, so it wasn't addressing all of the specific requirements laid out in this bill, importantly including the inspection schedule. In my written testimony, there's an appendix that actually lays out some of the food safety highlights in the President's bill and some of the targeted areas for that $75 million increase in the budget. It was to include many elements that are a part of this legislation, increased inspections, but not to the degree that this legislation would call for, the implementation of preventive controls, strengthened laboratory testing, a stronger integration of FDA and federal food safety efforts with the state and local activities, which is ultimately very, very essential to
Well,
the
that, you know, I know that the bill allows these fees to be applied towards a broad array of FDA's food safety activities. You know, in other words, it allows the fees to be used to boost FDA's ability to develop standards like performance standards or preventive controls. Do you agree that the fees should be applied towards all these activities that we mentioned in the bill?
I think we want a robust, comprehensive program, and those fees should be applied to putting in place that suite of activities. The preventive controls are directly related to what companies must do under the new legislation, and I think it's very appropriate that the fees cover that aspect. For example, the inspections obviously are directly related. Very important that the fees cover that aspect, and many other aspects of the portfolio of activities outlined in the legislation really are essential to what needs to be done to protect consumers and ultimately to protect the food industry so that the public and consumers can be assured that the products are safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Deal? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr.
It's okay.
Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you. Mr. Deal had to leave. Dr. Hamburg, as you probably know, Senator Kennedy and Durbin and Burr and Gregg have introduced a food safety bill on the Senate side. And has the administration endorsed that bill, or has it endorsed this bill, or has it endorsed any bill?
You know, I have to be honest that I have not. I've only been on the job 7 days, and I have been focused on your piece of legislation.
Okay.
And so I'd be happy at a later time to discuss in more detail the bill on the Senate side.
But as far as you know, the administration has not endorsed either bill.
I don't believe so.
Okay. Well, the reason I brought that up, there are some significant differences in the Senate bill and the House bill. And one area of difference relates to recall authority of the FDA. And under this bill, the FDA would have the authority for a recall if an article of food may cause adverse health consequences. That would be the legal standard, may cause. But in the Senate bill, it says that there must be a reasonable probability of serious adverse health consequences or death. So those standards are significantly different, and I was just asked you, since you're now going to be responsible for this, that first standard that's in this bill seems so general and so nebulous in a way. Does that bother you, or don't you think it would be better to have a more precise, identified standard for recall?
Well, I certainly understand the concern that you're raising, and I think that there may be opportunities for some wordsmithing. Certainly, we would never seek to recall a product without, some reasonable expectation that there was serious adverse consequences and harm related to that product. A recall is no small issue, both in terms of resources and efforts on the part of the FDA, and also its implications on industry and consumers who want access to those products. So I think it's an area that we'd like to work with you on for language that we wouldn't want it to be too overwhelmingly prescriptive, because you want to have the flexibility in that kind of potentially emergency situation to move forward.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think this is an area that we should look at because we know the ramifications of a recall, the expense involved, and certainly we want to have a balancing of protecting the public versus preventing undue expenses to companies as well. So I'm glad to see that is at least an area that you would be willing to talk about. I might also say the same thing would apply to these access of records. There really is no standard at all in this bill, but on the Senate bill, it says that if FDA has a reasonable belief that an article of food prevents a threat of serious adverse health consequences or death, FDA would have access to and be able to copy all records and so forth and so forth. But under this bill, it appears that the FDA would just have blanket authority to request any records at any time without any sort of standard being met.
Well, here I'd like to stress that I think access to routine records is extremely important to assuring a safe food supply. It is very important that when inspectors go into a facility, they can examine certain aspects of what have been the procedures during a preceding period of time and not just inspect what's happening at that moment. Had we been able to have better access to routine records in the case of PCA, which has been talked about already this morning, we would have been able to see that there was documentation of contamination several years earlier, which had not then been adequately addressed.
My time is about expired. I'd like to ask just one additional question. It relates to Jan Schakowsky's comment in her opening statement about the use of antibiotics in the agriculture community and the fact that more and more people seem to be establishing immunity to certain antibiotics. Is that a concern of yours?
It's a huge concern of mine in terms of the growing problem of antibiotic resistance in this country and around the world, and the implications that it has for our armamentarium of antibiotics to address serious and life-threatening diseases. I think it's an area that merits a lot of attention by the FDA, working in partnership with others. It's a topic I'd be happy to come back and discuss in more detail with you, and it is very high priority for me in terms of overall goals to improve public health.
Thank you. Chairman Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Welcome again, Dr. Hamburg. Congratulations. My first question, it'll be a yes or no answer. Yes or no. Well, inspections are an important part of finding and addressing food safety problems. Isn't this correct?
Yes.
Your agency does not have a good record when it comes to inspecting food facilities. Last year, you inspected 6,562 food facilities. In the United States, 152 foreign facilities in the same time. Was that enough inspections? How many should you have, and what resources would you need to do the job?
I think we can do better with respect to the question of exactly how many. I cannot tell you that now, but
I will submit you a letter asking these questions in greater detail.
I was warned that you would do that.
And I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open to include both my letter and the response of the administrator. Would you support an increased frequency requirement?
We clearly need to do more frequent inspections. We also need to do smarter inspections, and we need not to rely simply on inspections as our tool for a safer food supply.
We agree on that. I am keenly aware that there is a substantial cost associated with conducting foreign and domestic facility inspections. How much do you need to do this properly in terms of personnel and money? If you can't give it now, I'll ask the record be kept open.
All right.
So
Well,
it's
a complicated answer, and there are some unknowables, but we need a lot more money.
Let the record remain open so that this can be inserted at appropriate time.
Mr. Chairman, the record will remain open. You don't have to keep saying it.
And it is clear that with new inspection requirements, FDA is going to need new additional resources to meet that requirement, is it not?
That is absolutely true.
The President has asked additional resources for food safety activities at the agency. He requested, I'm told, about $259 million in additional money. Is that correct?
Yes.
It was the president's intent that these additional dollars amounting to $164.8 million in new budget authority and $94.4 million in new fees, registrations, reinspection, and export certification would be used for for increasing the number of food facility inspections conducted by your agency. Is that not correct?
It would be used for that as well as other components of a more comprehensive, modernized food safety system.
It's correct that the President's budget requests for food safety's activity did not include any new requirements that may come with the food safety legislation or new food safety legislation that we're considering here. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, but could you repeat the question?
The President's request for new monies did not include monies to address the questions that you will be compelled to face under the new legislation. Is that correct?
It addressed some components, but not the full
not all.
panoply of requirements that are outlined in this legislation.
There are many who have resisted new money for improving food inspection frequency by the agency. They've asked that the use of these dollars for such activity be prohibited. Would you agree with that or disagree?
You know, I hate to do this, but this style of questioning is...
I'm sorry, I have limited time, 1 minute and 12 seconds left.
Could you just repeat the question?
Question, do you agree with the idea that we should prohibit the use of registration fees for inspection?
I think we need registration fees to enable the agency to do its inspectional activities and other components of a food safety plan.
As a matter of fact, one of the few successful activities at Food and Drug at this particular time is what you do under PDUFA, which is supported by fees. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
And you're starving in almost every other place. Isn't that so?
Correct.
Can you state with any certainty the number of people, importers, customs brokers, filers who import products under FDA's jurisdiction to the United States in any year? I believe the answer to that question is no.
Is no, and this legislation would enable us to get a much better handle on who is out there producing and distributing food for U.S. consumption.
And the reason is that they are not currently required to register with FDA. Isn't that the reason?
That's a large part of the reason, yes.
Isn't it important to FDA to have an accurate, up-to-date accounting of who these people are?
Very important.
Now, these individuals are not required to comply with certain requirements to ensure the safety of these products that they import. They can handle any type of FDA-related products and are not required to have any specific training so to do. Is that not correct?
That is correct. We would like to make sure that individuals importing food into the United States followed standards and guidelines that we expect with domestic food production.
Good. The domestic draft, the discussion draft establishes a program to require importers, U.S. custom brokers of foods, drugs, and devices and other filers to register with FDA and require that good importer practices are maintained as a condition for maintaining registration. Do you agree with that requirement?
We would like importers to be registered.
Now, one more question well, I tell you what, I note my time is up. Madam Administrator, I will be submitting you a letter. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience, and I thank my colleagues. I would note that the changes in the draft that we have before us today are those which have been largely done in consultation with FDA and in consultation with my minority colleagues. The next changes that you see will originate in about the same way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell. Next is the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer.
Thank you. Given your statement, you support the FDA's ability to trace foods more quickly during an outbreak, so you would support a track and trace system with regard to food. Is that correct?
I would. I think it is very important to our ability to respond quickly to outbreaks of concern.
And you, since you appear to be endorsing the bill, this draft discussion bill in front of us, you also support then the FDA's ability to increase inspections of food processing facilities. Would that be correct?
I think we'd need to do more inspections, but as I said earlier, I think we also need to recognize that it isn't simply increasing the number of inspections that will get us to the food safety system that we need, but it's also instituting the preventive controls and really shifting the way we think about food safety, and also stronger partnerships with state and locals and foreign governments.
Ma'am, when you discover contaminated food, you believe it's your responsibility then to prevent the distribution of that contaminated food into the marketplace. Is that not correct?
Yes.
So you're asking for that ability to do a recall. Would that be correct?
Yes.
And that once that contaminated food has been discovered, do you believe that you should have the ability to order the destruction of the contaminated food?
It depends on the specific circumstance. Sometimes with the contaminated food, it might be possible to reprocess it and make it available in a safe way. But if it is contaminated and putting consumers at risk, and such an option does not exist, then that food should not be allowed to be provided to consumers.
Since you support a federal tracking system for food, would you also be willing to support a electronic pedigree system for an interoperable tracking system for pharmaceuticals?
I think that in both realms, it is very important to know where things
Is this
came
yes?
from and where they're going.
Is this a yes?
Well, I'm reluctant to
You're going to choose contaminated lettuce over adulterated drugs? I don't think so.
No, I'm not. I didn't think your question was either or.
All right, my question is, if you're going to support a pedigree system for the tracking and tracing of contaminated food, don't you also believe that it's important for us to have an electronic pedigree for the tracking and tracing of pharmaceuticals?
In concept, I think, as I said, that traceability is very important to assure that what consumers get.
All right. Let me get to this.
Safe.
We have 11 international mail facilities. Add 3 other mail facilities, DHL, UPS, and FedEx, of which 30 to 35,000 packages, pharmaceutical packages, come into those mail facilities every day. So do the math. When you do your inspections, about 80% of them are either adulterated or they're counterfeit, knockoffs, yet FDA claims they don't have the ability to destroy. So you're sitting here before this committee today saying that you now believe that you should have increased ability to inspect and to go after this contaminated food. I want to make sure that you also believe that you should have the ability to destroy these counterfeit, knocked-off drugs, because if you just do the math, that's got to be in excess of 350,000 counterfeit, adulterated, knockoff drug packages per day. That's millions of packages per year that are harming people. So let me go right to you. Do you believe that FDA should have the authority, equal authority, to destroy these counterfeit, adulterated drugs?
As I indicated earlier, this is my 7th day on the job, and I haven't been briefed in full on all these issues. The problem of counterfeit drugs is a huge concern, and I am eager to work with you since you clearly care very much about it.
You know what's happening right now? They're sitting right now. Here's Customs, and right over here is FDA. There's not even a wall. Yet Customs has the ability to destroy, but you claim you don't have the ability to destroy. Please don't come before this committee and tell our country that you think we ought to be able to protect you with regard to food, but with regard to drugs, I can't believe as a doctor you wouldn't say.
I'm not telling you that, sir. What I am telling you is that these are issues that are at the heart of the FDA mission, and as a physician, extremely important to me. They're issues that I am determined to work on, determined to work with members of Congress to find appropriate solutions. But I'm not comfortable at this time discussing the specifics of that program,
All right,
which
ma'am,
I haven't been fully
I will be willing to
briefed on.
work with you because I can't believe that this would be an issue that you would equivocate on. I will yield back.
Gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Hamburg, I want to add my welcome to that of my colleagues to your appointment. I know you're going to be working with this committee on a lot of different issues. I want to talk to you about the traceback system because we have worked very closely over the years, and most particularly on this latest iteration of the legislation, on setting forth mandatory characteristics that would be contained in the tracing system that the FDA sets up through the regulatory process. For example, the bill requires that the origin and previous distribution history of food must be maintained, and that history must be linked with the subsequent distribution history of the food. And it also requires, to me, this is a really key component, that the system be interoperable. So for different types of food, they can figure it out. Some people question whether it will ever be feasible to implement this type of system, and I'm wondering if you can give your opinion on the feasibility of this type of a traceback provision.
Well, as you indicated, it is very, very important and key to our success in being able to respond swiftly to outbreaks and make the appropriate interventions to protect the American public. Interoperability is absolutely key because it involves a whole range of different players along the full life cycle of the product. And that's one of the great challenges. I think as we move forward in developing and implementing a traceability program, we need to work very carefully with industry and with the different components of the food production system. We need to do it in the context of public meetings and open exchange, but that should be our goal, absolutely.
And in the draft legislation, that's exactly what we do, is we give the FDA the authority to work with industry and consumer groups to develop both the specific types of traceability technology and also the interoperability, correct?
Yes.
In other words, we're not saying different sectors of the food industry have different types of traceability requirements, and we're not saying that we have a one-size-fits-all. Correct?
Correct.
Do you think that there's an economic case to be made to the industry for better traceability?
I think absolutely, because with the opportunity to really do adequate traceback, we can really target what are the components of a food or the specific food products that are causing the problem, and remove those or put in place the interventions to decrease the risk to that particular component of the food life cycle. In that way, we can both save lives and reduce illness, but I think also reduce the costs to companies who, as we've heard about this morning, have occasionally been inappropriately targeted when the traceback was inadequate and we didn't identify the correct product, and also when there's a whole industry but it's only one processor or manufacturer that's the problem, then we can protect the rest of the industry by really honing in on the particular product at risk.
And once we develop the system, it should also make identification and removal of the specific contaminated food much more speedy than it has been, which again benefits consumer health and it benefits the economic interests of that sector. Just one last question. The draft legislation that we've prepared exempts farms that sell directly to consumers or to restaurants from the traceability requirements, the farmers markets and so on. Do you think that that's an appropriate carve-out for them?
I think that we have to recognize the burdens on smaller businesses, but we also, from a public health point of view, have to assure that when there is a problem, we can get access to the information that's needed to identify the source of a contaminated food. So we need to work very closely with.
Yeah. You know, one thing is that these farmers markets, for example, they're not broadly distributing their food. It's just local. So if someone did get sick, the state health department could easily trace it.
It certainly
right
makes
back.
it easier to do the outbreak investigation.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman from Illinois is ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a process question first?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a possibility that the subcommittee may consider this legislation next week?
Yes.
And if so, I would ask then if members who could submit questions for the record by the close of business tomorrow, could we have witnesses respond to those questions by the close of business Monday?
Sounds like a good idea to me, since we're likely to mark up next week. You have no problem with that?
I think that's a very appropriate approach.
Okay.
Thank you.
We do know
Without objection, that's what we'll do.
we know that's challenging, but of course this is a draft, and as I said in the opening statement, so we appreciate that. And again, we do appreciate your testimony and welcome on board, and we're all working for, really on the same team, trying to get responsible legislation that protects human health while ensuring that fees go to where fees need to go. I just have two. One, and this goes back in history, 2 decades ago when Congress was deliberating how to improve the state clinical laboratory testing, and I've been in the lab tech issue a lot. This committee, under the leadership of now Chairman Emeritus Mr. Dingell, Mr. Waxman, and my own former colleague Mr. Madigan, issued a conference report stating that proficiency testing is considered one of the best measures of laboratory performance, and arguably the most important measure since it reviews actual test results rather than merely gauging the potential for good results. As we examine the discussion draft and its call for accreditation standards for laboratories to perform analytical testing on food, in your opinion, should proficiency testing be explicitly included here too?
I think that we would only want to work with accredited labs, and the accreditation process addresses those kinds of concerns. The accuracy of the testing is key to making the right decisions, and I think that as we move forward, laboratory testing needs to be a strong component of what we do, and so efforts to ensure the accuracy of testing results is absolutely key to protect businesses and to provide the public health system with the information it needs to take action on.
And I would agree with that. I think that's as close to a yes as I'll get, and that's fine. But I think that's a critical component in, if we're going to do this, that the proficiency test be a process by which we test the testers, so we have some certainty. Let me go back, and I know we've talked about this $75 million in the President's budget and the $375 million in revenue. And I mentioned this in my opening statement before some of the discussion, and I understand that this legislation offers more authority, and so that's why there may be a differing number than what the President proposed. But I think a lot of us are going to be challenged by the fact, and what would be helpful before we move to markup is, show us the money. Show us where we came up with this amount. As I said, also, there's already been millions of dollars put into food safety over the past 6 months. A lot of us are trying to understand where $375 million came out. We understand that there was 1,000 per facility, and you add up the facilities, you get $375 million, but that doesn't answer the question as to where is that money? Is that money going to go to an inspection regime? And what does it cost to do an inspection regime, especially on this? I've been really a strong spokesperson for a risk-based system. Now, the risk-based system promoted in this draft legislation is nowhere near what I believe a risk-based system should be. I think you should go after risky individuals and facilities that, in essence, offer no risk. You ought to incentivize them, and this has been statements that I've made for a long time. So I think even this risk-based approach that we're saying can be modified somewhat. So is there a way to get us a better handle, or do you have better numbers that support this discussion draft that $375 million actually means $374 million more dollars worth of ability to inspect?
Well, regrettably, I don't believe that the $375 million will cover the costs of inspecting on the schedule outlined in the bill. We actually would need considerably more resources to do that. We know, based on estimates vary, but that domestic inspections cost a little over $9,000. International inspections are probably threefold higher, and the number of facilities requiring inspection are very, very large, numbering in the hundreds of thousands.
Well,
so the numbers add up quickly.
And my time's expired, and I apologize. I would just say that there's going to be skeptics that say, okay, we've got $375 million on a fee schedule, and it's not going to go for inspection. It's going to go to other aspects of the FDA, and it would help provide us some clarity. And Mr. Chairman, if I can just end on this, because the Chairman Emeritus mentioned this once again, that there's been negotiation with his Republican colleagues. I would call them information positions of the answer of no, not really negotiations on addresses of the bill. And I would encourage, maybe this is going to be a member discussion, but if we really want to claim that we want a bipartisan bill, we ought to have some, just not dictates, this is what we're going to do, but this is where we need to work together. And I yield back my time.
Thank you. Let me just reiterate again what Mr. Shimkus suggested in terms of the questions. We're going to ask the witnesses, including you, in the next panel, and I'll remind the next panel that they submit their questions, that members submit questions by the end of tomorrow night, which would be Thursday night, and that we have responses by the end of business day on Monday. Okay? I'll mention that again. I mean, I don't know if it may be difficult to meet that schedule, but
yeah, would the chairman yield? And we understand that's a lot to ask, but
right.
For us to move, I think it's...
Yeah, that's fine, and we'll
No, we're happy to comply with that. We appreciate that you're taking this so seriously and wanting to move it forward swiftly.
All right, thank you. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've sat here for a few hours listening to this hearing, and I think the content is very important, and I do think this committee has developed an enormous record on this subject. This is not new information for members of this committee, and I do think we will be able to move legislation next week, and I hope it will be bipartisan, and I agree with Mr. Shimkus that there should be opportunity for the other side to participate. I wanted to acknowledge a comment that Mr. Boyer made before he left the hearing room. He was in some fashion implying that Dr. Hamburg is not focused on drug safety. My response to that is, of course she is. She's been here for 10 minutes, and the first topic up is food safety. So let's give her and this committee time to focus on that subject in the near future and not be accusing each other of, in some way, of perhaps inadequate attention. On the subject of food safety, which is what we're talking about, there is a section in the legislation about testing by accredited labs. Last year, I recall a huge worry about whether the prior administration was going to cut back on the number of accredited labs and the impact that would have on major ports of entry, like the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. My district happens to be there, that are the place where enormous amounts of imported food enter the country. So I just want to give you a chance, Dr. Hamburg, not in terms of a yes and no answer session, but could you assure us that lab capacity is a priority of yours, and assure us that there will be adequate lab capacity for the anticipated importation of food and for the standards in this legislation to work.
Absolutely. Laboratory testing is an essential component of a strong science-based food safety system, and we do not have any plans to restrict our laboratory capacity. And I think, as we move forward, we will want to make sure that we are applying the best possible science, including laboratory science, to our testing and screening activities. I hope that there will be advances in laboratory science and technology that will enable us to do our inspections in a more efficient and cost-effective way. But it's a pillar of what we do, and we will continue to support it. And we may, as resources become available and needs suggest, actually expand our capacity.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm not suggesting that our current lab structure be frozen in time. Obviously, if there are improvements either in location or in function, we ought to embrace that. But another one of the concerns that has been expressed is the ability to get the results from the lab to the FDA in a timely manner. Do you think the current system is adequate in that respect, and are you thinking about improvements to that?
Well, we're eager to implement a system for reportable foods that will include laboratories reporting positive tests to FDA, and I think that will be a very important additional element to our activities.
Good. Well, I appreciate that, too. Obviously, in light of some of the recent outbreaks and their devastating impact on human life and health,
Yes.
It's important to get that information out and accurate as soon as possible. Mr. Chairman, I don't have further questions of the witness. I'm just thrilled that she's here. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think your time is almost up. Thank you for your patience with all of the questions and listening to all of our opening statements. In your testimony, you referenced Section 106 that provides the more explicit authority for FDA to access food records during inspections. Do you think that that's enough, or should we go further in the legislation to mandate that those records be forwarded to FDA?
I think what's outlined in the legislation is certainly a very good starting point. We don't want to be inundated with information. We don't want to put too much of a burden on industry, but we do need that access to records. We need companies to keep appropriate records, and we need to be able to have it to be able to inform our routine inspectional activities, to be able to work with the companies to make sure that they have adequate preventive controls in place. And we need it certainly in the event of a serious outbreak of public health concern to enable us to swiftly get the information we need for action.
So you think that requiring them to have their plans and to have their plans audited in conjunction with your authority to have access to the records should be sufficient?
I think we would want this to be a dynamic process as we learn more, putting in place the programs and policies, and then learning from experience. But I think that the bill lays out a very sensible and doable approach.
Okay. And you also talk about the huge task of hiring and training inspectors. And if I understand correctly, you're asking for some more flexibility in the legislation to be able to do that. Are you asking for general flexibility, or would a transitional timetable with time certain in the legislation work just as well?
Well, I think we just have to recognize that this would be an enormous scale-up of activity, and that we need the time frame to enable us to do it right, to recruit the people and train the people to work with industry to develop the systems that work. So we'd like flexibility in that way, and we would like more general flexibility so that we can learn as we go in terms of the inspection schedule and some of the requirements in that regard.
Okay, my last question is kind of a general one. I don't think it was asked before, but even as late as yesterday, someone asked the Secretary the question about one single entity to secure food safety with the authority over the food safety program for the country. I'm sure, I don't think the Secretary supported it. I'm sure you don't support it, but what can you say about, if you've had a chance to look at how FDA and USDA work together or don't work as well together as they should, what can you say about addressing the concerns that gave rise to the legislation that would put it in a single entity?
Well, a couple of responses to your important question. One is that clearly, as the new FDA commissioner, I have a first and urgent priority to strengthen food safety within the FDA, and I think that there are many things that we can do to strengthen our program, to improve accountability, to raise the issue as a high priority. Part of strengthening food safety within FDA is strengthening coordination with critical partners as well, and that certainly means with USDA, and I look forward to a productive working relationship with them. It also means strengthening the working partnerships with state and local public health organizations, and it very importantly also involves working with other international agencies and foreign governments, because I think we're going to see the percentage of food coming in from overseas increasing in the years to come, and the globalization has a profound impact on the work of the FDA. And I also do think that the authorities and tools that this new draft legislation could potentially provide to the FDA will be extremely important in moving the federal government and the FDA in the direction that we need to for a robust and modernized food safety system.
Thank you for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Dr. Hamburg, for your service and for all that I'm confident you're going to do to improve food safety in this country. As I mentioned in my opening statement, Ohio has been hit hard by issues arising from food safety. In the past year, there have been 105 cases of salmonella reported in Ohio, and sadly 3 deaths resulting from the most recent peanut-based strain. Nellie Napier was a constituent of mine who unfortunately died from salmonella poisoning that she contracted in a nursing facility. And just in April of this year, in Cuyahoga County, there were 3 incidences of illness from E. coli and another death, this time a 7-year-old girl. So this is an urgent issue for the people that I'm so honored to represent. I mentioned that I introduced the Protect Consumers Act, which was a bill that would give the FDA mandatory recall authority, and I'm happy to see that it is a part of this comprehensive bill. And I'd just like to get a little bit more of your opinion about the need for recall authority. And this bill, of course, seeks to remedy the situation of the FDA not having the mandatory recall authority by laying out 2 different types of recall authorities. First, if the FDA believes that a certain food may cause adverse health consequences or death, the FDA can require a recall. But in that scenario, FDA must first give the company an opportunity to voluntarily recall its own products, and if that doesn't work, then the FDA can order a mandatory recall. And then, of course, the second type of recall is an emergency recall if the FDA finds that a certain food presents a threat of serious adverse health consequences or death. You may do that immediately. Can you just tell me about whether you think that the need and the approach, the 2-tiered approach, is addressed in a good way in this bill, and why it makes sense?
Well, I think the history is that voluntary recall is often effective in getting those potentially harmful products off the shelves and protecting consumers, but that you do need that emergency mandatory recall function as a backup. There certainly have been cases where the mandatory recall of a dangerous product has been delayed because of a reluctance on the part of the company to pull that product, and there's been a back and forth and lawyers involved and delays of weeks, putting consumers at risk. So I think that to have the mandatory recall as an emergency measure is very, very important. And sadly, in a world where we might also need to address intentional contamination of food, that emergency mandatory recall becomes a very, very important tool. I think the reality is that it having that as an enforcement tool probably makes it easier to also work with companies on the voluntary recall. So I think it's a continuum that we need. We need both.
Will the gentlelady yield just on this same point? Just a follow-up on this?
I have very little time, but I'll yield.
Yeah, just to follow up, one of the issues would be may cause. That's kind of a low standard. I think there's going to be concern about the may cause language in here, and how do you define that?
Yes, well, we discussed that earlier, and I think perhaps there's some wordsmithing that could be done on that point.
Thank you. I thank my colleague.
Sure, and if I could just follow up on the suggestion that has been made, and some have argued that because mandatory recall is such a strong tool that only the commissioner should be able to exercise the authority to order a recall with no further delegation. And I just wanted to know about your thoughts on the approach of having only the commissioner order a recall and how that would work for the FDA. And frankly, while I'm at it, would such an approach work with regard to suspensions and subpoenas? And what are your thoughts about those subjects?
Well, these are important and powerful authorities that shouldn't be used lightly. However, I think that experience shows that senior level officials can be entrusted with these authorities along with the commissioner, but it's certainly something that we would want to work with Congress on in order to put in place the system that people have the most confidence in.
I thank you, and I'm certain that we share concerns about expediency and making sure things happen in a quick time, and I think that your answer on the way that the recall authority would work, you having the mandatory authority would give you an opportunity to encourage even more strongly, or they would be necessarily encouraged, the companies to comply on their own as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Dr. Hamburg, appreciate your patience today. But if you think this is tough, you have FDA to work on, which is, and I laugh because in 2007, we spent a great deal of our time, both in the subcommittee and the full committee, in reforming FDA. And then last year, with all the food safety issues that came up, it seemed like we're back at it again, and I'm glad you're there. In my opening statement, I mentioned my concerns about the location and number of FDA labs, and I know my colleague from Southern California, Congressman Harmon, mentioned the same thing. Texas does have the longest running border with Mexico, and the Port of Houston, similar to, is right behind Port of LA Long Beach, and imported tons of food. Yet we don't have an FDA lab, and I've had the honor to meet my FDA inspectors on the docks at the Port of Houston, but they are detailed out of Laredo, Texas. And I guess because it's such a large state, in the need for a lab somewhere, I'm glad the bill does include the ability to contract with labs, because that's we want the inspections done as quick as possible. Does the FDA intend to evaluate the current locations of the 13 labs and whether these locations are meeting the inspection demands? But also in the President's budget talks about 3 high-volume FDA labs, and how would the FDA decide where to place these labs? and what considerations be placing in place like Texas or even Southern California. I didn't know Southern California didn't have a lab with LA Long Beach. And that's my only question. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you know, I'm fascinated that the laboratory issue comes up so much here because it's such a key issue. And in my past experience as a public health official, it's often the laboratory that's the underappreciated component of public health needs. So this is very encouraging to me. At the present time, we don't have any plans to expand that basic, you know, network of laboratories that you mentioned, although, as I said to Congresswoman Harman, you know, with additional resources and expanding need, that might be a possibility. We will be creating some additional high-throughput laboratories, and in all honesty, I'm not certain about the process by which those laboratories are being developed and cited. It's something I need to go back as a very new FDA commissioner and learn more about. But the laboratory issue is one that is essential, as we've discussed.
I guess the reason it comes up so often is that over the last 3 years, actually, our committee spent so much time on, you know, pharmaceutical safety, food safety, and the concern is that we're importing so much of our food. Like I said, Laredo, Texas is probably the biggest land-based port in the world, and so much food comes from Mexico. We need the inspections as timely as possible to move the produce or whatever the products, the foodstuffs particularly. But we also need to make sure that it's, and the problem is it's not paid for. But with this fee that's going to be assessed, hopefully that will generate the resources both for the personnel and also for the facilities. And I guess if you're having to contract with private labs, that may be great, but there are times that a public lab would be faster and ultimately cheaper to the folks who pay the bills. And so that's why I just asked the FDA to look at that. I'm glad we're going to contract because we want the commerce to flow, but if there is a need to have a lab that would be more economical and just as fast as contracting with the private labs, then I would hope this funding source, because I guess over the last 3 years our hearings have said FDA's the staff, we don't have the staff, we don't have the resources. Well, we're going to try to give you the resources in this bill and hopefully to hire the staff and to have the facilities.
And let me also just assure you that your constituents are not being compromised in terms of the laboratory testing that's needed to protect their food supply, because samples can be shipped to labs. It doesn't, in the modern era, it can be done in a timely and safe way. So the coverage in terms of laboratory testing is still available, but I hear and understand your concern about the gap in terms of an on-site facility in your region.
Well, and I think the fear that some of us have is that we don't want to play favorites. These ports compete for cargo, and we don't want it to be based on that there's not an FDA lab or it's slower to get this through one port as compared to the other port. And I know I've run out of time, but appreciate the responsibility you're taking on, and hopefully we'll provide you with the tools that you need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Stupak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here. As Chair of Oversight and Investigations and one of the authors of the Food Safety Enhancement Act, I've had about 9 hearings in the last 2 years just on food safety, and certainly is a major problem. One of the problems I found every time we had a hearing, there was always a lack of information that the FDA did not have from either the manufacturer of the food or the producer of that food, and it was always difficult to get information. In the Safety Enhancement Act, authorizes the FDA to issue subpoenas for records and other things relevant to any hearing, investigation, or proceeding, or relative to any other matter within the FDA's jurisdiction, including matters under the Public Health Services Act and the Federal Anti-Tampering Act. Do you believe subpoena power would be beneficial to the FDA?
It's very important for us to get access in a timely way to the information that we need. And I think that authority will enable us to act more swiftly and effectively. Yes.
Well, we hope you would, because I think we're still waiting for information from the 2007 salmonella outbreak in peanut butter and from the Georgia plant, Blakely, Georgia. I don't think we got all that information yet. Some in the food industry, though, appear to be concerned that the FDA will abuse its subpoena power. Their concerns center around the subpoena provision that authorizes the FDA to issue subpoenas in matters under FDA's jurisdiction that are not part of a particular hearing or investigation of a specific violation of the Act. There seems to be a fear that FDA will go on fishing expeditions, constantly sending out burdensome, unnecessary requests for documents. How would you address these concerns?
Well, I think that we have enough work to do without going on fishing expeditions. We would be seeking information that would be of vital importance to addressing the tasks at hand. It would be of great value to have the ability to access critical information to inform the inspection process as well as to inform outbreak investigations. And I think that if we are going to be able to really move forward to ensure the safety of the food supply, this is one of a number of tools that will enable us to really do what needs to be done.
Well, it's refreshing to hear, because I've been pushing subpoena power for the FDA for 10 years, and I'd get a witness to agree with me from the FDA, but by the time I got back to my office, the FDA would call me and say, that's not the official position of the FDA, we're against subpoenas. So it's refreshing to hear that, and I'm sure you won't use it for a fishing expedition. Let me ask you this. Chairman Waxman and I wrote to you about to review bisphenol A, BPA. While a previous FDA commissioner found no problem with it, FDA's own Science Review Board says there was room for concern. And we wrote to you, and you've wrote back indicating that you've agreed to review the safety of BPA. So let me just say thank you on that point. I think it's important that we look at all the documents and all the evidence and all the studies, not just 2 studies when there's over 100 other studies that raise concern on bisphenol A. Also on food safety, on the lab situation, it's been my concern. The last FDA commissioner thought food safety was to close 6 or 7 of the 13 field labs, which I thought was the wrong idea. So we've always fought a reorganization or closing of these labs, and we actually had to put in legislation to make sure these field people who critical work for the FDA and for the safety of American people stay on their jobs. And you recently wrote back to me, myself and Chairman Waxman, indicating that there are no current or future plans to close or consolidate any of these 13 field laboratories. And you also went on and said that you're actually hoping you'll be able to hire at least 70 new analysis for the 13 labs to replace staff losses over the last few fiscal years. So thank you for that. And without objection, I'd like to place the record from the commissioner in the record, this letter in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Let me ask you one more question, if I may. Risk-based inspection schedule. One of the important new requirements in the new food safety bill will be to put into place is a risk-based inspection schedule for food facilities. Under current law, even risky facilities can go years between FDA inspections, but our legislation has strict requirements to make sure FDA inspectors actually get into the riskiest facilities as frequently as possible. The riskiest facilities must be inspected at least every 6 to 18 months. No food production or storage facility will go more than 4 years between inspections. Under current law, there is not any requirement regarding how frequently these facilities must be inspected, is there?
There is not, and I think that your desire to see a risk-based strategy be put in place is absolutely key so that we can target resources on the highest risk.
Does this bill give you the flexibility you need to modify the inspection goals based on available resources and the best available evidence on risk?
Well, as I said in my testimony, I am concerned about the requirements for inspection outstripping available resources, and that's been a chronic problem for the FDA in terms of being able to fulfill its important mission. I think that it's the inspectional strategy outlined in the draft legislation is a wonderful aspirational goal. I would love to be able to sit here and say that FDA could take it on and fully achieve it, but there is a reality of limited resources, both dollar and human, and I think that's where we need some flexibility to really look at the numbers and really also begin to move swiftly in the direction outlined in this bill, but also try to learn as we go so that we can find ways to do our inspections in a more efficient, targeted way and really focus on the highest risk and really try to leverage other resources to achieve the goals as well through partnership with state and locals, partnership with foreign governments, and potentially with third parties that are certified and overseen by the FDA to help us, particularly with respect to the burgeoning number of foreign sites for inspection.
Well, the 400,000 possible facilities.
Sorry, Mr. Stupak, but we're like...
I just want to mention about the registration fee for 400,000
no more questions, though. We're done with questions. Go ahead. You had a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, hopefully the registration fee that we'd be putting in place with up to 400,000 facilities would provide enough resources to do the inspection and other work that the FDA sorely needs to the resources and the personnel to do it, and we understand that, and hopefully that'll be part of the bill. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your help on this bill.
Thank you. Mr. Deal.
Yield briefly to Mr. Shimkus for a follow-up.
And I thank my ranking member, and I'm glad my colleague's here, because I'm going to follow up on this wordsmithing that we talked about on the may cause. That's why we still have the same problem on the subpoena power issue, because in the subsection 3 it says any other matter relative to the commissioner's jurisdiction under this act. There's not. I would like there to be a may cause. I have a problem with the may cause in the other part of the bill or the draft. We should at least have a may cause for offering a subpoena to someone, and so I would hope that that would be something else we'd look at. So I think there is some issues. We want subpoena power, but we want it be for a reason. We just don't want it to be at the whim of, with all due respect, Dr. Hamburg. And I'll yield back to the ranking member.
Let me ask you a question with regard to another area, and that is the registration and fees collected from commercial importers. And there's been a change in this draft from previous drafts that we have seen. Specifically, why should drug and device manufacturers who currently already pay an annual establishment fee be required to pay a duplicative fee, and what entities are really encompassed within this commercial importation fee schedule?
Well, the importer fee refers to fees on the individuals or the companies that are serving as the link between foods that are grown, processed, manufactured overseas and being brought into the United States to be distributed to consumers here, and so they're not necessarily representing a given manufacturer, but it's a very important function because it's that bridge between what is happening on the international scene and what is coming into this country for use.
Specifically with regard to the drug and device manufacturers who currently already register and already pay a fee, would you envision that they're going to have to pay an additional registration fee in addition to what FDA already collects from them? And if so, why?
In terms of the importer function, I need to go back and look at this issue with respect to devices, because I don't know how that system is set up, whether it's the manufacturer that is serving in that role or not. So I will go back and learn more about that.
I think that's one that we really seriously need to look at. I don't think we ought to be duplicating what you're already doing because you have jurisdiction there. I think that would be unfair. Let me ask you also quickly with regard to the tracing of food, the tracing system that is put in place for you to issue regulations. It appears that would include the restaurants to be able to have traceability, and I'm told that about 7 out of every 10 eating establishments are not part of chain operations. They're just independent, separate food operations. I'm just curious as to whether or not you think that this would have a serious impact on these small business owners, and do you think we ought to do a cost-benefit analysis before we impose that kind of cost on these individuals?
Well, I think clearly we want to work with restaurant owners and small businesses in order to make sure that systems are not too cumbersome, but it's very important that they keep records, because if there is a tainted food that is in their facility, the implications for the health of their business as well as for the health of their consumers is very significant indeed. And I think that they would want to be able to assist in sharing their information about where the foods came from, so that the trace back can occur and we can identify the source of an outbreak and control it. So I think they're a very important link in the food supply chain, and protecting health really depends on them keeping records.
Let me ask you, what has FDA done to implement the current, what I think is called the one up, one back traceability requirements? What has been done to implement that?
Well, the one up, one back has been in place, as I understand it, for a while now, but it has proven not to be adequate to really capture the full life cycle of a product, and that we really need, as I mentioned earlier, the full supply chain to be documented and integrated. Interoperability, not just fragments, is really key to successful and swift investigation of outbreaks and the ability to control a problem and prevent future exposures to a contaminated food product.
Thank you. Just the way we're proceeding, Mr. Markey is going to go now, and he's our last questioner for you, Dr. Hamburg. We have one vote, but we'll be right back after that, and then we'll start with the second panel. So, Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Congratulations, Dr. Hamburg.
Thank you.
You may know that I have a bill that calls for BPA to be banned from being used in food and beverage containers because of the risks that have been identified. We've also recently learned that the food and chemical industries have launched a public relations campaign opposing any efforts to deal with this issue. Is the FDA concerned about BPA, and what does the FDA plan to do about those concerns?
Well, we are concerned. Certainly, I'm aware of some of the studies that have raised issues in animal populations, and some of the information about BPA in many components of the food supply. We are starting to see activities at the local and the state level in terms of action with respect to BPA, and I would hope that FDA could really be providing leadership on some of these issues of assessing and analyzing risk. We are taking another look at the BPA issue. The acting chief scientist at the FDA has been asked to take the lead on this because, of course, this is a decision where we have to bring the best available scientific data to bear. We need to look at all of the studies and examine them, but it's an issue of great consequence for Americans. As a mother as well as a physician, it's an issue that I think we need to look at seriously, and I look forward to being able to come back with some report from this serious look that's being taken, and we expect that it's going to be a task for him over the summer to lead this review, and by the end of the summer, beginning of fall, we hope to be able to put forward a fresh look at the BPA issue.
Do you have any advice for parents who are concerned about their children ingesting this chemical?
Well, I think, of course, parents that are concerned can find alternatives that don't have BPA. And for the most part, I think that those alternatives are pretty clearly labeled and pretty available. And I think anyone with concerns, should do so.
Okay. Thank you for your work on this. If you could keep us posted on the progress you're making on
Absolutely.
the evaluation of it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Dr. Hamburg. As we've said, we do intend to move forward on this bill next week, and we appreciate your input and whatever else comments you may give us by next Monday. My intention is we have one vote, we'll come back, and then we'll hear from our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership on this important issue.